So now, if you look at your agenda, we're about to begin our day with an individual I think we all know. I don't believe he's going to say it this morning, but I may just take him, to the side outside because I want to hear him say it. I want to hear him say it. But it's my privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker of the morning. And if you look, I believe his biography, he's got a short bio there. I'm going to read a short bio back to you before I introduce him. And again, no stranger, wonderful gentleman, and I'm super, super happy that he was able to make it here. I want to listen to him. Personally, I want to listen to him. So, with that, I want to introduce Diom Romeo Saganash. He's the Member of Parliament. Romeo's story is not typical. He has values from the Cree, a childhood spent in the forest of northern Quebec, a survivor of Indian residential school. His hard work and education has helped him to become the first Indigenous lawyer from the University of Quebec, Montreal Law School. A lifetime of spent working to uphold human rights. Romeo was born on the shores of a lake in his parents' tent because his parents lived a traditional lifestyle. The only language he heard and spoke for the first 7 years of his life was Cree. After he finished residential school, Romeo was asked by his chief to attend a conference on the 10th anniversary of the signing of the first modern treaty in Canada, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. It was there that his love for the law began. His accomplishments are many. He is one of the principal authors, and you'll have to excuse me because I do not want to say that. I'm not a French individual, so I will totally butcher that. I will let Romeo explain that to you. He has been a key negotiator for many national and international initiatives, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Romeo founded the Cree Nation Youth Council in 1985, served as Deputy Grand Chief of the Grand Council of the Cree for a number of years. A passionate environmentalist, Romeo served as Vice Chair of the Cree Regional Authority sector with CreeCo Incorporated and the EU Corporation, correct? He showed his understanding of how to balance our duty as stewards of the land and sustainable economic growth. Romeo has a son, 2 daughters, and 3 grandchildren. So, with that, it is my privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker of this morning, Mr. Diom Romeo Saganash.
Chwajim nom swa. Nastawa and suggestion Gawi Samgan is Bejim Hidogach Ugaji Sagach. Nastawa can Skumun is some Chediak Gadukshinyaguda. Gagugajum Gangia, Jebetayan, Diemon, and Dabajamon, and Datemungia. Suggesting a Kadukshinada. Nanaskumungia, Kapitikuyan, Ut Nagudoska, Kaitsnadet, Skumun. And Sudadods, Surgeon never does, Kaji Dedoda, Kaji Witch Doda, Kaji Batsi Do, Uda, Utas. Njid, Dakota, Denege Kashingashido, Lakota, Nakota, Sotoge. And Skamajmaka, but bit kido da. But no. Jeji ni buyano da. Jeji yemi to go to get. Nuji can have mouth. Tell Higan. Cabbage bit kigo ikota. Nuji can have mouth, yeah. Nuji wagon. Georgina Jalibois in Gasso. Yeah, we the midnight there. That's it. Ottawa. Yeah, but see that. And Skomamak. Kadukshin do that. Mshenjin Deodach. Kawija Greek. Nuji Kana Mouch. Since come Nomak. Is some Chediak who get Unjis. Yamut Mokun. Jiska Gnate Koga. Timunano. So, contrary to what the MC just said, I'll try to behave this morning with you. Politicians don't always behave, but I'll try. Those were words of greetings and thanks to all of the people that have walked this land, and to all the people that have allowed me to be able to stand here this morning before you. I honor our ancestors. I also honored my fabulous colleague and good friend Georgina Jalibois, who's a member of Parliament sitting with me in Ottawa. Both her and I are, I think, the two Indigenous members of Parliament that speak their language fluently. And I will always be honored to call her my friend, as well as a good colleague in Parliament. And I also thanked creation for allowing me to walk in this territory. So good morning. Romeo Saganash in Saskatchewan. Was on beach no chin. Mugya, Tiwach was on a pea. No chimish, no smatsin. Michigimish is in Gadawan, Sakigan, Evdouch, Euchian. Nistum to eat the Bajam stir no. Then there was Chibitan in Saskatchewan, Romeo. Jagon Romeo at Saskatchewan. You probably know that I was the first Indigenous person in this country to run as a leader for a major national party, in my case, the NDP, which I did in 2012. And one of the most pressing questions that everybody asked throughout my travels in this country, and it costs a lot to run for leadership of a major national political party. And one of the most pressing questions that was asked by people throughout the country was, where the hell does that name come from for an Indigenous person? Romeo. Right? What kind of silliness is this? So the story goes, my mom tells me, is that there was a float plane flying north with geologists on board. And when they saw that there was a storm coming in from the north and the dark clouds, they decided to stop at this lake called Michigmish, because they saw there were 3 tents along the shore. And I had been born 2 hours before that, before they stopped. So my parents fed them bannock, gave them tea. And it turns out that the pilot's name was Romeo. So my mom gave me that name. That's where it comes from. That's a beautiful story. I want to start, there's a lot to discuss about languages, and I'll talk about the work that Georgina and I are doing in the House of Commons, and how we are close to achieving the reality that we can make our interventions, ask our questions, do our speeches in our languages. Myself in Cree and Georgina in Dene. We're close. And that is the first question I asked when I got to Parliament, when I got elected in 2011. I went to the clerk of the House of Commons and I asked her, can I ask my questions in Cree? Can I do my speeches in Cree? And she turned to me and said, Romeo, as a jurist, you surely know that the two official languages in this place, in Parliament, are French and English. An answer that I refuse to accept to this day. Not only because our languages have been spoken on this land for thousands of years, even before French or English was heard on this land. In my case, more than 7,000 years in northern Quebec. But also, and I think more importantly, because as Indigenous people, and if we are sincere about reconciliation, decolonization, well, we shouldn't be fighting for that right to speak our languages in institutions like the Parliament of Canada. So I've been doing this since 2011, try to convince Parliament and its authorities to allow me to do that. Because I truly believe that any future Indigenous MP who would want to speak their language in Parliament will not have to fight for that right. But I'll get back to that process, which is almost to a point of conclusion. As it was mentioned, Cree was the first language I heard and spoke for the first 7 years of my life. I held on to my language silently when I was in residential school. Many were not as fortunate as I, of course. We all know that, we all realize that. My mother carefully taught me the language. She's one of the better Cree speakers in our world to this day. I spoke that language for the first 7 years of my life before being taken away to residential school for the following 10 years. That's why, although they tried to take away my language, the roots of my spoken language, my spoken Cree, were so strong that I came out of residential school not only still possessing my language, but I walked away from there with 2 other languages, French and English. So they didn't know, they didn't realize, I guess, in those days, the creature that they've created with me. And one of the important teachings that my mom gave me was to appreciate the etymology of the words she taught me. She would say, repeat it very slowly. Repeat the words very slowly and understand where they come from. Understand the roots of the word. That's how you'll you'll appreciate the words. And it's true because it allows one to speak clearly, be it Saskatchewan. You know, people, my elders always tell me when I speak to them in Cree, "Nastawa to be at Saskatchewan. You speak very clearly." Well, that's because of my mom. And it also allows you to survive on the land. Because when you tell your parents, "I'm going to this lake," there's a difference when your parents respond, "Why, who? It's far." Bicheao, which is very far. So if you don't understand those subtleties in the language, then you cannot survive on the land. And that's what my mom always tried to explain to me. I'm sure that you know Cree divides most of its words into animate things and inanimate things, which emphasizes the importance of relationships. While some might worry in English or French about speaking in a sexist way by saying he or she, in Cree you don't have that problem, of course, since there's only neutral terms. Members of a community are perceived as very important in Cree, so there are two ways of translating we. One meaning you and us, Giano, and another meaning us only, but not you, Nian. Often where in English you would use a noun, Cree will use a verb instead, indicating that the world is perceived as a series of processes, then of static things. From birth, I have thought about the world based on these concepts taught to me by my mom. Our miumatsiwan, as we say in Cree, or living well on our homelands, requires understanding, strengthening, and adhering to our own traditional legal systems that, as you know, are centered around land-based teachings in our identities as Indigenous people. Over the 23 years that we drafted and negotiated the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I arrived in Geneva in 1984 on the invitation of our Cree ambassador to the UN, Ted Moses. Yes, we have a Cree ambassador to the UN, believe it or not. So Ted asked me, I was still young in 19, as the MC would say, when I was young. I was still young in 1984. So Ted asked me, Romeo, why don't you travel to Geneva with me? We're going to be working on this important document, and I want you to participate. I think you would be good at this. He said, you don't have to do anything. Just observe. We'll be there for 2 weeks, and you'll see how we do it. So I traveled to Geneva in 1984. And from there on, every single year for the 2 weeks that the work went on the UN Declaration, every single year. There are very few people on this planet that are able to tell you, I was there for the 23 years that this process lasted. I was there for the 23 years. So from 1984 to 2007, I was in Geneva for 2 weeks every year to draft and negotiate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we thought it was important to include articles in the UN Declaration that would protect, preserve, revitalize Indigenous languages, and many of the provisions in the UN Declaration articulate that fundamental human right that we have with respect to our languages. The UN Declaration, by the way, has been translated into more than 50 Indigenous languages to date. More than 50. So I think that is an important tool that we need to continue to use. Because languages and names are, in my view, markers of identity. And that's important. I was asked by a radio host just a couple of minutes ago what language means to me. Well, over the years, as a politician, I'm always asked whether I'm Canadian first, or Québécois, or Cree. No, I will never identify myself as a Canadian, nor Québécois, even though I'm from Quebec. It's a fundamental element of who I am and where I come from. I'm Cree. There's a Cree language, there's a Cree history, there's a Cree territory, and there's a Cree way of life, and there's a Cree way of seeing and understanding things in this world. Research, apparently, has shown that language is directly related to a sense of identity and the physical and economic health of individuals, and also, I would add, our communities. Language is one of the most obvious symbols of cultural and group identity. It is the living expression of thought, of specific cultural understanding, the link to the past, and that's important for all of us. I'm sure you understand that. But also the key to the future, as it was so well mentioned. Language and its renewal play a vital role in the communities to be healed and to move forward from here on. I participated for the last 35 years in AFN assemblies, observing and listening to chiefs in assembly for the last 30 years, 35. And I recall 2 years ago when the Prime Minister announced that there would be an Indigenous languages legislation coming down the pipe. I was going to say pipeline, but coming down the pipe. And I was sitting in the back of the room. I was present in the room. And I have a good memory because I listened carefully, as my mom always asked. And when he announced that legislation to the chiefs, I had never seen, in the 35 years I attended these meetings, a standing ovation like that one. Because we all agree that our languages are important. So he had one of the most important standing ovations that any politician has received in the history of the AFN meetings. So I was sitting in the back. I was clapping as well. I was sitting in the back, and I said to myself, I hope that this guy is getting the cue. So we're 3.5 years into his mandate. Has anyone seen the legislation yet? Still promised, but I haven't seen it. I'll be meeting with the minister responsible for the legislation next week, and I want to make sure that our languages receive the same official status as French and English in this country. My territory, EUHG, as we say in Cree, which is the James Bay territory in northern Quebec, covers 450,000 square kilometers. It's a huge territory. In fact, my writing is about 54% of the landmass of Quebec. So everywhere I travel and do these speaking engagements, I tell people, you're looking and listening to half of Quebec right here, right now. And I always like teasing my other colleague, Nikki Ashton, who sometimes makes reference to how huge her writing is in northern Manitoba. I just like to remind her, Nikki, my writing is bigger than the province of Manitoba. But I'm fortunate to represent that writing because late Jack Layton, who courted me for many years before I decided to run in 2011, I think 6 years it took him to convince me to run, finally. But when I finally decided, I wanted to run in Quebec City because that's where I practiced law for 20 years. I wanted to run in Quebec City, and because I knew everyone in Quebec City, and I was convinced I could win in Quebec City. But Jack said, well, Jack never said no to me for anything. But he said to me, let me put it this way. Let me put it this way. He said, if you look at all of the global challenges that we have on this planet, climate change, environmental protection, resource development, water issues, our relationship with Indigenous peoples, the future of Indigenous peoples. These are challenges that we find throughout the planet. And he said to me, those same challenges you will find in the EUHG in northern Quebec. And he said, you know what, Romeo? You're going back home, buddy. So I ran in northern Quebec to represent my people, among others. It's a very diverse writing. Because one of the things that we also need to realize is that, unfortunately, we know that traditional cultures throughout the planet are in trouble. Environmental problems are making it hard for the plants, the animals, the waters in northern territories. The loss of biodiversity are largely due to development, is leading to the gradual decline of traditional land ethics that harmonize Indigenous use of the land with conservation of the natural world. When practices of traditional land management stop, the ceremonies stop, as well as our languages. And as a result, the encoded ecological knowledge that comes with it. So our languages are necessary also to protect the environment. We are fortunate in the Cree world that we have signed the first modern treaty in 1975, the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, which recognizes a decree to develop curriculum in Cree. All of our kids, for the first 4 years of their schooling, are taught in Cree, all matters. They are taught in Cree for the first 4 years. And that is why, even, I would add, even the school calendar in our area is adjusted to the Cree way of life. So our kids start school earlier than other kids in the province, and they finish later than other kids in the province because there's a goose break that lasts 2 weeks where every child in the community leaves with the parents and goes out on the land in the spring when the geese arrive. And they do the same during the moose hunting season. Which brings us to the fact that more than 90% of Crees in northern Quebec still speak the language fluently. In fact, all of the deliberations of the Cree Nation government are in Cree. So it forces our youth, our children, to make sure that they learn carefully the language if they are willing to participate in their government, in their governance in the future. And all of our deliberations with the Cree Nation government are simultaneously translated into French, English, and Cree. Most of the elders only speak Cree. My mom only speaks Cree. So every once in a while she would call me after watching the news. Everybody's talking about you, what did you say? I see you on TV, and everybody's talking about you, what did you say? And I told him, Jiwikan. I swore. Just to open that parenthesis, I'm usually a very well-behaved person, and I don't speak that way. And but I remember that morning, they told me that I had a question, but I had to ask a question. But they didn't have any suggestions in terms of what question I should ask. And so I said, well, what question can I ask? I've asked 2,000 different questions, and the answer has always, well, the so-called answer has always been the same, the talking points. So I had to come up with something else. I could have said, he doesn't give a hoot. I could have said, he doesn't give a fuddle-duddle. But it's not the same. I think it was the only word. And the only other time that I used the word was in 1985 when I got invited, and you heard the bio, when I got invited to Montreal for a symposium on the 10 years of the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. And on the second day of the symposium, there was this panel of lawyers that represented the different parties during the James Bay case, but also the negotiations that led to the James Bay Northern Quebec Agreement. So they had the lawyer that represented Canada, the lawyer that represented Quebec, the lawyer that represented the Inuit, Hydro-Quebec, and the lawyer that represented the Cree. And as I listened to James O'Reilly, who represented the Cree in those days, James was one of the very few lawyers in those days, in the late 60s, early 70s, that even dared to talk about the concept of Aboriginal rights in courts. He was one of the very first. He's a very good lawyer. And as I listened to James talking about the Cree, talking about the Cree territory, talking about Cree history, talking about Cree way of life, I sat there as a young boy listening to this, and I said to myself, really, in this way. Fuck, I can do that. I swear that's the only other time I used it. And I want to tell you another story, which is not as hilarious, but I think true to our theme for the next 2 days. Very few of you, or maybe none of you, know that I ended up in Hockey Hall of Fame. Not because of my hockey skills. I did play hockey. I was a very decent hockey player. But I ended up in the Hockey Hall of Fame because for the first time in 1986, for the first time in the history of this country, a hockey game was presented live, play-by-play, in an Indigenous language. Cree, in this case. Now, imagine doing a play-by-play of a hockey game in Cree. That's how you rock your language. And so, but in preparation of that game that we were supposed to, that we aired live on radio. It was a game between the Montreal Canadiens and the Quebec Nordiques, live. So everyone in the communities, in the Cree communities, had their radio on for the Cree play-by-play and the Cree analysis of the game, but they watched it on TV. Everyone throughout the Cree communities did that. But it took 6 months to prepare for that, because one of the things that we all realize as well is that there are certain concepts and words that did not exist in our language. We didn't have a word for puck. We didn't have a word for referee. So we sat down with elders for 6 months and explained the different components of the hockey game to them. And they came up with all the words. Our kids did not have a Cree word for puck. Now they do. Our kids did not have a word for referee. Now they do. Our kids did not have a word for a slap shot. Now they do. And that's because of the work of the elders. And we continued with that type of language development over the years. I helped in developing the legal terminology that we should use in Cree for treaty, for judge, for lawyers, for courtroom, and so on and so forth. So we did that development. We did it for the medical world as well, along with the elders. And they're pretty good at coming up with our own concepts in our own language. And we should pursue those kind of things as well. I was first elected in the House of Commons in 2011. And I know that most of you know that this is my final term. I'm hoping that Georgina will continue in the fine work that she's doing in the House of Commons, because we need more Indigenous members of Parliament in the future. There's about 10 of us right now, and that's certainly not enough. I've done my time in that prison. It is a prison. And because I'm going back to practicing law after this. But I did want to touch on certain legal aspects of our languages. I don't know how much time I have left. They haven't given me an indication. I can talk to you all day if you want. But I did want to touch on certain legal aspects. Canadian society seems to be too focused on Section 16 of Part 1 of the Constitution, which talks about the official languages in this country, French and English, and linguistic rights across the country. I don't think, and we learned this in law, but you cannot read Section 16 of the Constitution in isolation. Both Georgina and I made presentations to the Standing Committee on Procedures and House Affairs that studied the possibility of use of Indigenous languages in the House of Commons. Read up Georgina's testimony, which she did partly in Dene. I did my presentation in Cree, just to show them that this is possible to achieve in the House of Commons. So Section 16 to 21 of the Constitution are the sections that deal with language rights in this, under the Constitution. But the Constitution also says in Section 22, we all know Section 25, the Constitution, the non-derogation clause. We all know Section 35, Aboriginal and treaty rights, but this is what Section 22 says. Nothing in Section 16 to 20 abrogates or derogates from any legal or customary right or privilege acquired or enjoyed either before or after the coming into force of this charter with respect to any language that is not English or French. With respect to any language which is not English or French. That is the basis of some of our language rights. And of course we know of Section 35 and 25. We know of Recommendation 13, or Call to Action 13 of the TRC, which allows us to use our languages in institutions, political, legal, economic, social institutions. And we know of perhaps Section or Article 13 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'm told I'm given 5 more minutes left. But I do want to speak briefly about Bill C-262, which is the my private member's bill, which deals with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Bill C-262 was adopted by Parliament and is now before the Senate. It took me 2 years to convince the Liberal government to support it, well, in spite of their promise, to have the UN Declaration as the basis of their new, renewed relationship with Indigenous peoples. It took me 2 years to convince them, but they finally agreed. And I always say this about the UN Declaration and about Bill C-262, the United Nations Declaration Act, that it's not just about reconciliation, because that's what the TRC has called for in Call to Action 43 and 44. It's not just about reconciliation, but it's about human rights, and it's about justice. You cannot achieve reconciliation in the absence of justice for Indigenous peoples, for the first peoples of this country. There is no reconciliation in the absence of justice. Let's remember that. So when I came out of residential school after 10 years, I set out to do two things. I said to myself, I will go back to the bush, go back and live off the land, which I did for 2 years. until that moment in 1985 when I said, fuck, I can do this. But I also said to myself, I will give myself a mission to reconcile with the people that put me away for 10 years. And it's been more than 35 years now. So Bill C-262 is a very personal, private member's bill for me. This is my extended hand to Canadian society. This is my way of saying, okay, I accept your apology. Now let's move on proper basis. Let's move on the basis of justice. Let's move on the basis of human rights. Our rights have not been recognized enough as human rights. The courts have not dealt with Indigenous rights as human rights. Although the international community has dealt with Indigenous rights as human rights for the last 3 decades. And that has to change. Our right to clean water is a human right. Our right to housing is a human right. Our right to preserve and develop and revitalize our languages is a human right. Let's start looking at those rights on that basis. For the first time in 2014, the Supreme Court had talked about our rights in almost in that way when it said in Chilcotin, the charter rights under Part 1 of the Constitution and Indigenous rights in Section 35 in Part 2 of our Constitution are sister provisions that serve to limit, these are the words of the Supreme Court, that serve to limit the powers of governments, both federal and provincial. So let's start working on that basis, and that's what I'll be doing from the day I finish as Member of Parliament. I told the Prime Minister on February 14th when he made a statement on Aboriginal peoples and talked about this framework that no one has seen yet, but everyone talks about. I told him, I talked about that extended hand. And I said, one of the most beautiful words that we have in our language, in Cree at least, is Nui Jawagan, friend. But when you listen carefully to that word, Nui Jawagan, it's the person walking by your side. It's the person walking by your side. And I invited the Prime Minister to walk by our side. Nastawen sumno, kapits niyak jajibet, yemidugoch, jajibet tapach muyangia. Nsuggestion, gabinuda, nedeng gabin. Can start no, is the patch muyak chio. You may think I mean bego at the Kushinianoda. Saskatoon, Kasingatameko. Musn suggestion, a Wisangan, Sajimian, Sajitabamuyan, Sajipatsimanga, and Datamon. The book Shaitan, Jim Skimek, Mswajo, would cab yek, Jim Skimek, John, who yam would mass. Inuimun, the Denangan, Nian. Book and the book Shaitanga, Jijiwichi, Jim Skmokma, than the Jiji to take. And sin as you bore me and bego. As you bore me and I would suggest Diane. Diane, Sakigan. Jibobunga. Ashutian, Sakigans. At the Kshin, I come to you to tell. Get a gwen. a bit dead. Kan het skoog maken. En het zo doen ook shit, ja. Weske out dead. Na stawo udaten de out dead. Ja. Is nou shit. Kako gwetsmak. Den is een gaswin. Naskau jikushkobu. Oh, eskastino imno. Iteo. Mahikino jisangaso. Mahikino. Dwajmoyatska, Jimmy na. Heb petsko kwetsmet. Den is snaakshik en jis. Hoe ga je jis gaat? Jano. Niet maken jiko kwetsma. Dan ga je dichtaks. Deo dats. Kajistayas magayim hidias. Jibetsko kwetsmok. Dan de ik toting. Nede. Jida. Neden toten. Genotakende. Weepsies. Kabetset. Maji. Maji. I want to end it with that story. I don't know if it's a dream or something else. But a couple of years ago, I had this dream that I was crossing a lake. And I noticed that there's someone else coming from across the lake. And we met in the middle of the lake, dead winter. He was dressed in his traditional regalia. I could tell that he was an ancestor. So I asked him, Dinesh Ngashwin, what's your name? And he was surprised. He was surprised because he said, oh, you guys speak your language still? I said, yeah. So we talked. His name was Mahikino, he who was wolf. And he had these gray eyes. So we talked. He asked me questions about how it is for Indigenous peoples today. And I asking him how it was back then. So we talked for a while in the middle of the lake, middle of winter. And at the end of our conversation, he said to me, where are you going? So I said, Neda, over there. And he turned to where I was pointing at for about 5 seconds. He turned back to me and said, Maji, go. That was the message for me. So I went to Parliament. I went to law school. I want to make sure that for the future and for our children and grandchildren, that we do not have to fight for our language rights anymore. Miigwech.
If I could just get you to, so as all things, one of our teachings is to always gift one another. Old teaching is when someone walks into your house, first thing you do is offer them tea, bannock, as he said. And this modern day world, we still try to do that. So today in this house that we're standing in, the committee here once again do that same teaching, and we want to offer him a gift of thanks for coming and sharing that beautiful story and for saying that word. I loved it. I'm sorry. I'm a guy. And for me, it's the passion. It's not the word. It's not the word. If you watch the video, it's not the word that gets me. It's the passion behind the word. That's what I love about it, is the passion. So it's just a word to me, but it's the passion that I love about it. So today, we really want to thank Diom Romeo Saganash, Nehea, Member of Parliament. Again, one more time. Diom Romeo Saganash, Nehea, Member of Parliament.